Somewhere in Australia right now, there's a brand new car sitting under a showroom light that has not moved in over a year. The paint is still showroom fresh. The plastic is still on some of the seats. The salesman has stopped even trying to talk about it. This is not a rumor, and it is not exaggeration for the sake of a video. It is sitting right there in the official sales data that every manufacturer in this country has to report every single month. And when you actually go through that data line by line, what you find is stranger than almost anything a scriptwriter could invent. You find brand new Ford Pumas being sold in 2025, more than a year after Ford officially stopped making them. You find a Renault hot hatch that somebody, somewhere, tracked down and bought new, for reasons nobody at Renault Australia can explain. You find a hydrogen-powered Toyota that two people in this entire country decided to purchase, despite there being exactly one place on the continent where you can fill it up. This is the story of the cars that Australians simply will not buy, no matter what dealers try, no matter how deep the discounts go, and no matter how good some of these cars actually turned out to be when we drove them ourselves. Let's start at the very top of this list, because the winner, if you can call it that, might surprise you. The Ford Puma. Not a supercar, not some obscure European oddity, but a small, perfectly sensible crossover that Ford quietly discontinued in Australia back in February of 2024. And yet, in 2025, one single example found a new owner. One. Somewhere out there, a dealer had a Puma sitting on a lot, probably in a regional area, gathering dust under a car, port, and eventually someone walked in and drove it away. Nobody really knows how or why, but the sale got logged, and now it sits at the very bottom of the entire Australian new car market. The tragedy here is that the Puma wasn't even a bad car. It was fine. It was inoffensive. It did everything a small SUV needed to do, nothing more and nothing less. And that, in the end, is exactly the problem. Ford's story in this country over the last decade has been one long funeral procession of small and mid-sized vehicles. The EcoSport went, the Focus went, the Fiesta went, the Kuga went, the Mondeo went, the Escape and Endura went too. One by one, Ford Australia gave up on anything that wasn't a Ranger, an Everest, or a Mustang, because that is where Australians were actually spending their money. The Puma was simply the latest name added to that graveyard, and its solitary 2025 sale is really just a strange little epilogue to a story that had already ended. Right alongside it, tied for the exact same rock-bottom result, is the Mazda CX-9. This one stings a little more because for years the CX-9 was actually a genuine hit. During its best days, Mazda was shifting somewhere around 500 of these large 7-seat SUVs every single month. Families loved it. It looked upmarket without an upmarket price tag. It drove nicely for something so large, and it undercut the true luxury brands by a significant margin. But production ended in February of 2024, and Mazda made a very deliberate decision after that. Instead of replacing the CX-9 with something similarly priced, they pushed upward into properly premium territory with the CX-90, a beau vehicle that starts at nearly $70,000 before you've even added on road costs. And buyers noticed immediately. In one recent month, the CX-90 managed just 61 sales nationally, a number that would have been considered a disaster for the old CX-9 on its very worst day. Mazda has clearly recognized the problem too. Then things get genuinely bizarre, because tied at just one sale each are two more cars that have absolutely no business still appearing in sales figures at all. The Mercedes-Benz E-Class Coupe and Cabriolet is one of them. Mercedes made the sensible decision to fold these two-door E-Class models into the new CLE lineup, which is actually working out well for them, since the CLE has already found well over 600 buyers this year, and the standard E-Class sedan is still moving steadily too. So how does a coupe or convertible that technically doesn't exist anymore manage to sell one unit? The most likely explanation is almost embarrassingly simple. A dealership somewhere had one sitting in inventory, quietly forgot about it, and roughly 12 months later, somebody finally remembered it was there and sold it as new. It is less a story about market demand and more a story about spreadsheet archaeology. The second one tucked in at that same single sale is even stranger, and honestly, kind of wonderful. The Renault Megane, in its regular non-performance form, was killed off back in 2022. Renault then spent its remaining energy on the Megane RS Sport performance models before eventually retiring the entire Renault Sport division a few months after that. Their swan song, their final send-off for one of the great hot hatch nameplates, was the Megane RS Ultim, a strictly limited run of just 40 cars, priced from around $67,500. That someone tracked down and purchased one of those remaining Ultim editions brand new in 2025 is genuinely satisfying in a strange way. It suggests that somewhere out there, at least one enthusiast still cared enough to hunt down the very last one, rather than simply buying whatever hybrid SUV was sitting closest to the front door of the showroom. Moving up slightly, with 2 sales apiece, we land on the Citroën C5X. Citroën made the call to exit the Australian market completely in November of 2024, closing the book on the brand here entirely. And yet, almost a full year later, somebody managed to find one of these leftover mid-size sedans and drive it home new. Which is a shame, honestly, because when this car was tested by reviewers here, it genuinely impressed people. The ride comfort was excellent, the fuel economy was strong, the interior fit and finish felt properly considered, and the only real letdown was a transmission that could feel a little hesitant at low speeds in traffic, starting from around $57,670. When new, it wasn't even particularly expensive for what it offered, especially considering it was built with genuine attention to detail. But Citroën's brand recognition in Australia had eroded to almost nothing over the preceding years, and no amount of product quality was going to overcome that on its own. Whoever ended up with one of these final 2 units almost certainly got an extraordinary discount to make it happen, and probably a genuinely underrated car in the process. Also sitting at 2 sales is a name that will make sense the moment you hear it, the Mercedes-Benz EQS sedan. Along with its smaller sibling, the EQE, the entire high-end Mercedes EQ electric lineup arrived in Australia with enormous fanfare and then essentially collapsed within a couple of years. These days, Mercedes dealers are offering these flagship electric sedans at drive-away prices that are, in some cases, close to $100,000 below where they originally launched. As one example, an EQS 450 4MATIC sedan that originally listed from around $222,400 before on-road costs can now be picked up, drive away for roughly $134,500. That is not a small discount. That is close to half the original price disappearing within a few short years. Mercedes has reportedly made the decision globally to stop pushing these dedicated EQ models forward, choosing instead to fold electrification into standard E-Class and S-Class underpinnings going forward. The 2 people who bought a new EQS in 2025 almost certainly walked away with one of the single best value luxury electric cars available anywhere in the country, purely because nobody else wanted one at the original asking price. Right alongside the EQS, also with 2 sales, is the Peugeot 508, in both sedan and wagon form. Peugeot pulled the 508 from Australian showrooms back in August of 2024, and if you're being completely honest, it's almost surprising this car ever appeared on local roads at all, given how rarely you'd actually spot one. It originally launched from around $88,000 plus on road costs for the GT plug-in hybrid fastback variant, before receiving a fairly dramatic price cut down to $59,990 drive-away, as Peugeot tried to clear remaining stock before its exit. Even at that reduced figure, it still only found 2 homes in 2025, which tells you just how far Peugeot's brand equity had fallen in this market by that point. And that matters, because critics genuinely rated this car well across the board. It is a legitimately capable and well-engineered plug-in hybrid sedan, but there's a real risk hanging over anyone who does buy one, because if Peugeot eventually follows Citroën out of the Australian market entirely, that purchase turns from a clever bargain into a potential parts and servicing headache down the line. Then we arrive at what might be the single strangest entry on this entire list, the Toyota Mirai. Yes, a hydrogen fuel cell car from Toyota, sold new in Australia to 2 separate buyers in 2025. On paper, hydrogen power sounds like the future. 0 emissions, quick refueling compared to charging an EV, and a genuinely clever piece of engineering underneath. In reality, the Mirai in Australia has mostly existed as a fleet vehicle for a handful of security firms, most of whom have since switched over to conventional electric vehicles instead. The infrastructure problem is almost comedic in its severity, because as far as most reports can confirm, there is essentially one place in the entire country where you can actually refuel a Mirai with hydrogen, and that's the Toyota Hydrogen Center out in Altona North in Melbourne. Toyota is even dealing with a class action lawsuit in the United States from Mirai owners who say they've been left paying for a car they simply cannot use due to a lack of fueling stations there too. So, who bought the 2 Australian examples in 2025? And more importantly, how do they plan on actually driving them anywhere outside of Melbourne's west? Remains something of a genuine mystery. Climbing to 3 sales, we find the Audi A8 and its high-performance S8 sibling. The standard diesel-powered A8 was actually removed from the new car lineup here a couple of years earlier, but the twin-turbo V8 powered S8 hung on until the very end of 2024 before it too was quietly phased out. And that's a genuine shame, because this generation of S8 is, by most accounts, one of the finest large luxury performance sedans built in the last 5 years. Enormous power, effortless refinement, and the kind of understated presence that lets you arrive somewhere important without shouting about it. The most likely explanation for who bought the remaining examples is that a corporate hire car or chauffeur fleet added one last big Audi to their lineup before shifting entirely toward the BMW 7 Series, which is now essentially the only comparable option left standing in this segment. It really does feel like the closing chapter for an entire era of fast, understated V8-powered luxury sedans, a category that has almost entirely disappeared from new car price lists altogether. Which brings us to the one car on this entire list that you can actually still walk into a dealership and order brand new today, the Lotus Emea. With somewhere between 3 and 5 sales, depending on the exact reporting period, this fully electric performance sedan is, remarkably, still an active current production model, priced from around $177,990 plus on road costs for the entry Emea 600 variant. This isn't a leftover, isn't a discontinued nameplate, and isn't some forgotten inventory item finally clearing a lot. It is a brand new car that Lotus wants you to buy right now, and almost nobody is taking them up on the offer, which is genuinely puzzling because when this car was actually tested and driven, it left a strong impression. The technology inside feels properly current. The comfort levels are excellent for something this performance focused, and the acceleration is seriously quick, hitting triple figures in around 4.2 seconds. It's essentially been positioned as a China-built alternative to the Porsche Taycan, and on paper it should be doing better than this. But when you consider that Mercedes-AMG can't even move a comparably impressive EQE 53 at a near $100,000 R discount, it becomes a lot easier to understand why an even less established name like Lotus is struggling to find buyers at anywhere near full price. A more affordable Emea variant has since been introduced in an attempt to turn things around, but based on how the market has responded so far, that outcome looks unlikely. One more name deserves an honorable mention here, even though it just misses the very bottom of the list, and that's the Jaguar I-Pace, with 3 units sold after production wrapped up in December of 2024. In many ways, the I-Pace is one of the more tragic stories on this list because it arrived years before most of its competition, offering a genuinely competent electric SUV with around 446 kilometers of range on the WLTP cycle, back when almost nobody else in this segment had anything comparable. It was simply too early and too expensive for a market that wasn't ready to make the jump from petrol to electric power just yet. Priced from around $147,475, plus on road costs, it never found the audience it probably deserved. And now, with Jaguar pivoting its entire brand identity toward an entirely different, more divisive future direction, buying one of these final examples carries real risk, even if the car itself still holds its value surprisingly well on the used market. Now, all of the cars we've just covered share one obvious thing in common. They're either fully discontinued or so close to the end of their production run that dealers are simply clearing out the last few units sitting in the back corner of the lot. But there's a second, arguably more interesting category here, and that's cars you can still order brand new today, with full manufacturer backing, that are nonetheless struggling badly against the current market. And the best example of this is the Honda Accord. In 2025, Accord sales fell 29%, down to just 98 units for the entire year, across the whole country. 98 cars. That makes it the slowest-selling mainstream midsize sedan currently on sale in Australia, once you exclude models that have already been discontinued entirely. Its sibling, the Honda Civic, isn't setting the world on fire either, managing just 933 sales across the same period, a number that actually puts it behind the BMW 1 Series, the Audi A3, and the Mercedes-Benz A-Class, 3 genuinely premium branded hatchbacks that Honda is somehow losing volume to. And here's the thing, deliveries of both the Civic and the Accord have continued sliding even further through the opening months of 26. Despite all of that, Honda Australia has publicly stated they intend to keep both models on sale, arguing that it's about giving customers genuine choice and maintaining a value proposition that still works for the buyers who do want them. Whether that commitment survives another year or two of numbers like this remains to be seen. And the reason models like the Accord and Civic are struggling isn't really a mystery once you zoom out and look at the broader shape of the Australian new car market in 2026, because this year has brought one of the most dramatic reshuffles the industry has seen in decades. Chinese manufactured brands, led primarily by BYD, alongside Geely and Chery, have surged forward at a pace that's caught almost every legacy manufacturer off guard. In June of 2026 alone, Australia recorded an absolutely record-breaking 140,000 plus new vehicle sales for the month. And yet buried underneath that record-breaking headline number was a genuinely brutal reshuffling of market share. BYD alone recorded close to 19,000 sales in that single month, up around 131% compared to the same. a month a year earlier, finishing just a few hundred units behind Toyota, the long-standing, decades-long market leader in this country. Subaru, meanwhile, posted the steepest decline of any major brand that month, falling 37% to under 3,000 sales, with the Forester down over 24% and the Crosstrek collapsing by over 53%, largely because Subaru simply doesn't have a genuinely competitive electrified option to offer buyers who are now actively shopping for hybrids and EVs. Nissan told a similar story, dropping 33% to around 2,300 sales for the month. And even Porsche, a brand that rarely appears in conversations about struggling sales, fell 33%, driven almost entirely by the Macan, which plunged an enormous 83%, as Porsche transitioned that model over to an EV-only powertrain that buyers, for now at least, don't seem ready to embrace at the same volume as before. Even Toyota, the single most dominant brand this country has ever seen, wasn't immune, recording a 21% decline in one recent month, a genuinely rare occurrence for a brand that has held the #1 sales position in Australia for more than 2 decades running. And what all of this really tells us is that the story of unwanted cars in Australia right now isn't only about a handful of obscure, low-volume nameplates quietly disappearing into the history books. It's also about entire brands and vehicle categories getting caught flat-footed by a market that has shifted direction faster than almost anyone predicted. Large SUV sales across the board, spanning both mainstream and luxury segments, are down almost 12% this year alone. A genuinely significant contraction for what used to be considered one of the safest, most dependable segments in the entire industry. So, where does that leave us? On one end, you've got the tail end of a long list of genuinely discontinued nameplates, cars like the Puma, the CX-9, the old E-Class Coupe, the Megane, the Citroën, the Mercedes EQS, the Peugeot 508, the Toyota Mirai, the Audi S8, and the Jaguar Y-Pace, all of them essentially selling their absolute final handful of units to a tiny group of dealers, collectors, and, in at least 1 or 2 cases, people who simply forgot a car was still sitting in inventory somewhere. On the other end, you've got the Lotus Emea, a genuinely current, still available, still actively marketed car that simply cannot find enough buyers willing to pay full price for it, largely because it's competing against far more established luxury EV rivals that are themselves being discounted by tens of thousands of dollars just to move volume. And running underneath all of that, you've got an entire industry-wide shift taking place in real time, where established, once untouchable brands like Subaru, Nissan, Mazda, and even mighty Toyota itself are watching market share get pulled away from them by an incredibly fast-moving wave of Chinese-manufactured hybrids and electric vehicles, led by BYD, that are arriving with sharper pricing, stronger electrified powertrains, and a level of momentum that traditional manufacturers simply weren't prepared for. None of this means any of these specific cars are necessarily bad. In fact, several of them, the Citroën C5X, the Mercedes EQS, the Audi S8, are genuinely excellent vehicles that reviewers rated highly when they were tested. Dealers desperate to clear these exact vehicles off their books are often willing to negotiate discounts that would have seemed unthinkable just a couple of years earlier. But if you're going down that road, it's worth going in with your eyes open, understanding exactly why that particular car is sitting there unsold in the first place, and what that might mean for things like resale value, ongoing parts availability, and long-term servicing support a few years down the line. Because in this market, the difference between a genuine bargain and an expensive mistake usually comes down to exactly that kind of homework. It's also worth stepping back and asking why this is happening now, in this particular year, rather than gradually over the last decade. Part of the answer is fuel prices. Escalating petrol and diesel costs through the first half of 2026 pushed a huge number of everyday buyers toward hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and fully electric vehicles almost overnight. And that shift happened faster than most legacy manufacturers had planned for. Electrified vehicles, taken together, now account for close to half of all new vehicle deliveries in this country, and battery electric vehicles alone have pushed past the 20% market share mark for the first time. That is an extraordinary shift for an industry that was still treating electric vehicles as a niche curiosity only a few years earlier. Brands that had a genuinely competitive hybrid or EV lineup ready to go, like Toyota with its hybrid RAV4 and Camry, or BYD with its rapidly expanding model range, have been able to ride that wave. Brands that didn't, like Subaru, like Nissan, like large chunks of the Peugeot and Citroën lineup before they exited altogether, have been left exposed in a way that shows up immediately in the sales charts. The other part of the story is simply how fast Chinese manufacturers have scaled their operations here. It wasn't that long ago that brands like BYD, Chery, Geely, and GWM were seen as curiosities, cheap alternatives for buyers who couldn't afford anything else. That perception has essentially collapsed. BYD has grown its year-on-year sales by well over 100%. Chery has grown by close to 80%. And newer arrivals like Geely have posted growth figures in the hundreds of percent, admittedly off a smaller starting base, but the trajectory is unmistakable. Geely alone delivered close to 11,000 vehicles in the first half of 2026, an increase of nearly 500% compared to the same period a year earlier, putting it on a genuine path toward cracking the top 10 best-selling brands in the country within the next year or two. Newer names again, brands like Zeekr, DePaul, and Denza, went from selling next to nothing to posting hundreds or even thousands of units within a matter of months, essentially starting from a standing start and scaling almost instantly. That is the kind of disruption that simply didn't exist in this market 5 years ago, and it helps explain why so many long-established, once dependable nameplates are suddenly appearing on lists like this one. It's not universally one-sided either, and that's an important detail worth including. Not every Chinese branded vehicle is riding this wave upward. LDV, for example, actually posted a real decline in one recent month, down over 20%, while Jessie fell by an even steeper 70%, dropping from over 100 units down to just 35. That tells you something important, that simply being a Chinese, manufactured, competitively priced vehicle isn't automatically enough to guarantee success anymore either. As more and more of these brands pile into the same segments, competing directly against each other rather than just against the old guard, some of them are already starting to cannibalize each other's sales, which suggests the next chapter of this story might involve Chinese brands themselves, ending up on lists exactly like this one, competing for survival against each other rather than against Toyota or Mazda. What all of this really points to is a market in the middle of a genuine structural correction, not just a temporary blip. Total new vehicle sales across the country have stayed roughly flat overall this year, which on the surface sounds stable, but that flat headline number is hiding an enormous amount of movement underneath it. Every single unit of growth that BYD, Geely, and Chery have posted has effectively come directly out of the pockets of brands like Subaru, Mazda, Nissan, and even Toyota itself. This isn't a market that's growing and lifting every brand along with it. It's a market where the pie has stayed roughly the same size, but the slices are being cut and redistributed at a genuinely historic pace. For buyers, that means more choice, sharper pricing, and dealers more willing than ever to negotiate on models that simply aren't moving. For manufacturers still relying on the same lineup and the same pricing strategy that worked 5 years ago, it means the kind of numbers we've walked through today, cars sitting on lots for months or years at a time, quietly becoming case studies in exactly what happens when an entire industry shifts direction faster than some of its biggest names were ready for. And that ultimately is the real story behind every single car on this list. It was never really about any one of these vehicles being fundamentally broken or badly built. Several of them were genuinely well-engineered, well-reviewed, and in some cases actively praised by the same critics who now can't explain why nobody bought them. It was about timing, about pricing, about brand momentum, and about an entire market shifting underneath these cars faster than the companies building them could react. Keep an eye on this list over the coming year, because if the current pace of change continues, some of the names sitting comfortably in the middle of the sales charts today could very easily be the ones we're talking about 12 months from now.